I had always found old things unsettling. Antique items seemed to carry some kind of energy, like they were tied to a past better left alone. My mom, however, adored them. Every weekend, she would scour flea markets and antique shops, returning home with something new. Dusty books, candle holders, porcelain figurines. "They have a soul," she'd say, carefully dusting off her latest find. I never believed her words until she brought home the doll. It happened on a Saturday. I was sitting in the kitchen when Mom came home, her arms full of treasures. Among them was a large bag, from which she pulled it. "Look at this amazing find," she exclaimed, holding up the doll. The doll was strange. Tall, made of porcelain, with faded blue eyes that seemed unnervingly large. Her black hair was curled into glossy ringlets, and her once white dress was now a dirty, tattered gray. "Mom, why do you even need this?" I asked, my irritation obvious. "She's beautiful, a rare antique," Mom said, clearly oblivious to how eerie the doll looked. She placed the doll on a shelf in the living room, directly across from the couch. Now, every time I sat there, I could feel its glassy gaze following me. Sometimes I even thought its head was slightly turned toward me, though I knew that was impossible. I tried to ignore it, brushing off my unease as overactive imagination. But each night, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The first strange occurrence happened a few days later. I woke up in the middle of the night to an odd sound. It was faint, like soft, deliberate footsteps on the wooden floor. At first, I thought it was Mom moving around, but the sound didn't seem to be coming from her room. It was from the living room. Curiosity got the better of me. Grabbing my phone, I turned on its flashlight and carefully went downstairs. The living room looked normal at first glance, but then I noticed something odd. The doll wasn't on the shelf. My heart started to race. I scanned the room and finally found it lying on the floor near the window. Maybe Mom accidentally knocked it over, I thought, though it didn't make much sense. Why would she leave it there? I picked up the doll and returned it to the shelf. This time I made sure it was securely positioned. After double-checking, I switched off the lights and headed back upstairs. But as I lay in bed, I heard the footsteps again. They were louder now, moving with a strange rhythm, as though something small and unsteady was walking across the floor. The next night, I woke up with a sharp sense of being watched. The feeling was so strong I couldn't ignore it. Opening my eyes, I was met with darkness. The room was pitch black, save for the faint glow of moonlight slipping through the curtains. Reaching for my phone, I turned on the flashlight and scanned the room. At first, everything seemed fine. My desk, my chair, the closet, all were in their usual places. Then I saw her. The doll stood in the corner of my room. She was perfectly still, her head slightly tilted to one side. Those cold, glassy eyes stared directly at me. I froze, my mind racing. How was she here? I distinctly remembered leaving her on the shelf in the living room. For a long moment, I just stared, unable to move. Finally, summoning all my courage, I got out of bed, picked her up, and carried her back downstairs. Her porcelain body was cold to the touch, and holding her filled me with a strange unease. I placed her back on the shelf, making absolutely sure she was steady. Turning on every light in the living room, I gave myself a moment to breathe. But as soon as I turned off the lights and headed back upstairs, I heard it again. A faint creak, followed by a thud. When I looked back, the doll was on the floor once more. After that night, my sleep was never the same. The footsteps, the soft thuds, the whispers, they all grew more frequent. It was as though the house had come alive, each sound clawing at my sanity. But the most terrifying moment came the night she tried to enter my room. I was just about to fall asleep when I heard the now familiar sound of footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and coming down the hallway toward my door. The steps stopped right outside. Then came the scratching. It was faint at first, like a gentle tap of nails against wood. Then it grew louder and more insistent, as if something or someone was trying to claw its way inside. "Who's there?" I whispered, though I didn't want to hear an answer. What I heard instead was her voice. "Let me in. Let's play," she said. It was soft, childlike, but it carried a chilling undertone that froze me in place. Before I could react, the door slowly began to creak open. The light in my room flickered and went out. Grabbing my phone, I turned on the flashlight just in time to see her. The doll was standing in the doorway, her head tilted, her lips stretched into an unnatural smile. She took a step forward. "Don't be afraid," she whispered. "It's only a game." The next morning, I told my mom everything. She looked at me with a mixture of disbelief and concern. "It's just your imagination," she said. "You've been stressed lately." "Mom, I'm not making this up. The doll moves on its own." Mom sighed and offered to put the doll in the basement. Reluctantly, I agreed, hoping it would stop the strange events. That night, the house was eerily quiet. For a moment, I thought it was over. But then I heard them. The footsteps. They were faster this time, almost frantic, as if something was running down the hallway. I heard the basement door creak open. "You thought you could hide me?" Her voice echoed. The room grew cold, and the light above me began to flicker. Then it went out completely, leaving me in darkness. When I shone the flashlight at the doorway, she was there. Her glassy eyes glowed faintly, and she began to move toward me, her tiny feet clicking softly against the floor. "You have nowhere to go," she said, her voice soft and sinister. I couldn't let this continue. Desperate, I searched online for ways to banish cursed objects or spirits. One article mentioned a ritual that might sever her connection to me. I gathered candles, drew a protective circle with chalk on the floor, and placed a mirror at its center. That night, I sat inside the circle, clutching my phone tightly. When I heard her steps, I forced myself to stay calm. She appeared, as she always did, her figure emerging from the shadows. Her movements were slow, deliberate, and filled with malice. "You can't stop me," she hissed. "You won't scare me anymore," I replied, though my voice trembled. She stepped closer, but when she reached the edge of the circle, she stopped abruptly. Her expression twisted into one of rage, and her glowing eyes brightened. I began reciting the words I had found. "You do not belong to this world. Leave now." Her porcelain body began to crack, and from those cracks seeped a black, smoke-like substance. "You will never win," she whispered as her form dissolved into nothingness. For the first time in weeks, the house was silent. But sometimes, in the stillness of the night, I still hear faint footsteps in the hallway. It started like any other evening. After dinner, I went up to my room, finished my homework, and collapsed onto my bed. As usual, my parents wished me good night. Mom leaned over to kiss my forehead, her warm smile the perfect end to the day. "Sleep well, sweetheart," she said. Dad added, "Don't forget to close the window before you sleep, like always." They left, and the house fell into silence. I could hear the clock ticking in the hallway and the soft rustle of leaves outside my window. I was almost asleep when I heard it. "Come here, sweetheart," the voice called. My eyes snapped open. It was my mom's voice, but something about it wasn't right. It sounded muffled, as if it came from outside. I sat up in bed, straining to listen. The voice came again. "Come here, help me." I walked to the window and looked outside. The streetlight faintly illuminated the yard, but it was empty. At the edge of the woods, I thought I saw a shadow moving between the trees. "Mom?" I called out, but no one answered. A moment later, the voice came again, louder this time. "Sweetheart, come here." I quickly pulled on my jeans and a hoodie. If Mom was outside and needed help, I couldn't just stay in my room. But deep inside, something felt wrong. I went downstairs, my footsteps echoing in the quiet house. The air was strangely cold, even though the windows were closed. As I reached the kitchen, I heard a faint creaking sound, like someone was moving carefully across the floor. I stopped at the back door, my hand hovering over the handle. "Mom, are you there?" I called out. Her voice responded immediately, as if she had been waiting. "Open the door, sweetheart." The voice was so familiar, but something about it felt off. It was too perfect, too rehearsed, like someone trying to mimic her. My heart pounded as I stepped back, a sense of dread creeping over me. Suddenly I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around, but there was only the empty hallway. Silence. Then her voice came again, now softer, almost a whisper. "Aren't you afraid of me?" I decided to go upstairs and check on my parents. Maybe I was just imagining things. When I opened the door to their bedroom, everything seemed normal. They were both asleep, Mom's face turned toward the window. I felt a wave of relief. "Mom?" I whispered, stepping closer. She didn't move. I leaned in to wake her, but something made me stop. Her face looked wrong. It was too still, too smooth, almost like a wax figure. Her eyes suddenly snapped open, and I stumbled backward. Her gaze was empty, like she was staring through me. "Why won't you listen to me?" she said in a cold, unfamiliar voice. I bolted from the room, slamming the door shut behind me. My heart raced as I leaned against the wall, struggling to catch my breath. Back in my room, I tried to make sense of what had just happened. Was I dreaming or losing my mind? Then I heard her voice again. This time it was coming from outside. "Sweetheart, come here." I moved to the window and looked out. At the edge of the woods, I saw her. She was standing still, her long hair blowing in the wind. "You can't hide from me," her voice whispered, but it didn't come from outside. It echoed in my head. Her face. I couldn't make out the details, but her eyes glowed faintly in the darkness. Her smile was wide, unnaturally so, stretching across her face. I wanted to close the window, but I couldn't move. My feet felt rooted to the floor. She took a step closer to the house. "Come to me, sweetheart," she said. The whisper was quiet, but every cell in my body screamed that this wasn't my mom. Summoning all my strength, I slammed the window shut and backed away. But the voice didn't stop. Now it was coming from everywhere. "Help me." I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to find out what was calling me. I stepped into the backyard. A light fog covered the ground, and the night air was colder than I expected. I walked across the grass, which felt unnaturally soft underfoot, as if it was waiting to swallow me. "You're such a good boy," her voice said, now warm and kind. I moved toward the woods, unable to stop myself. She stood ahead, her silhouette gliding between the trees. "Why did you leave the house?" I shouted, trying to sound brave. She didn't answer, only took another step closer. Eventually we reached a small clearing. The moon illuminated her face, and my stomach churned with fear. Her features were horrifyingly distorted. Her eyes were empty sockets. Her mouth stretched unnaturally wide, and her teeth gleamed, sharp as knives. "You're mine now," she whispered, reaching out a hand. I froze, but instinct took over, and I turned to run. The forest seemed alive. The trees moved, their branches reaching for me, while roots burst from the ground, trying to trip me. Voices surrounded me, all whispering, "You've gone too far." I tripped and fell, the earth beneath me shifting like it was alive. Blackened roots wrapped around my legs, pulling me down. Suddenly, she was there again, standing above me. "You'll stay here forever," she said, leaning closer. I don't know how I escaped. When I opened my eyes, I was lying on the grass outside my house. The first rays of sunlight were peeking through the trees, and birds chirped as if nothing had happened. But I knew the truth. I looked up at my parents' bedroom window. Their silhouettes were visible behind the curtains, but something about them seemed wrong. I couldn't bring myself to go inside. Eventually, I forced myself into the house. It was eerily silent. I climbed the stairs and hesitated at their bedroom door. When I opened it, they were lying in bed, just as I had left them. But something was off. "Mom?" I whispered. She turned slowly, her eyes opening. They were hollow, the same empty voids I had seen in the forest. "Why did you run away, sweetheart?" she whispered, her voice echoing in my head. I screamed and ran, slamming the door behind me. Everything has been different since then. Every night, I hear her voice calling to me. It pleads, beckons, promises safety and warmth. Sometimes it sounds like she's right outside my room. "Sweetheart, why won't you let me in?" she whispers. But I know it's not her. I don't sleep anymore. I sit in the dark, hugging my knees, waiting for the sun to rise. Sometimes I hear soft footsteps in the hallway. One night the voice grew louder than ever. It didn't whisper, it screamed. "You belong to me. Come back." I couldn't take it anymore. I stepped outside and stared at the black wall of trees. The fog curled around the trunks like it was alive. The forest was waiting. I took a step forward. When I woke again, I was in the forest. Shadowy figures surrounded me, their glowing eyes piercing the darkness. They were the ones who had heard the call before me. Their faces were pale, their bodies dissolving into the mist. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I knew then. I was one of them now. I returned home, but everything had changed. The house was empty, my parents gone. I realized I no longer belonged to this world. Now I am the voice. Every night I hear my own cry echoing from the forest. "Come here, sweetheart." And I'm terrified that someone else will hear it too. It began quietly, almost imperceptibly. At first, I didn't even realize something was wrong. For the first few days, I only felt slight tension in my body, like my muscles were stretching on their own. There was a strange itching in my fingers and chest. I thought it was just exhaustion, work stress, and the solitude of home. But soon those little things became far too disturbing to ignore. One morning, I woke up with a deep scratch on my palm. It was a thin but sharp line, as if drawn by a blade. I stared at it for a long time, trying to remember how it got there, but no explanation came to mind. Then the dreams began. On the first night, I found myself in a dark room. It was empty, the walls cracked and oozing a thick, tar-like black liquid. The floor was cold beneath my bare feet, and the air was so heavy it was hard to breathe. I knew I wasn't alone. In the corner stood a figure. It was hazy, as though made of smoke or fog. I couldn't discern its features, but its presence was overwhelming. "I'm here," it whispered. The voice was low, almost growling, as if it resonated inside my skull. I wanted to scream, but my voice froze in my throat. I woke up drenched in sweat, gasping for air as if I had been suffocating. My scratched palm throbbed painfully, almost as if trying to remind me of itself. It was just a dream, I told myself, but the anxiety lingered all day, refusing to let go. The next day, I began noticing things I couldn't explain. Every time I looked in the mirror, I felt like my eyes were different. There was something foreign in them, something that seemed to be watching me from the inside. But the most terrifying moment came one morning while I was brushing my teeth. I was standing at the sink, going through my usual routine, when I heard a voice. "Can you feel me?" It wasn't mine, but it wasn't coming from anywhere else either. It was in my head, calm but filled with power. I dropped my toothbrush and spun around, but of course, the bathroom was empty. I tried convincing myself it was just exhaustion or an overactive imagination. But that night, as I lay in bed, the voice came again. "We are one now," it whispered. "You know that." I bolted upright, panic coursing through me. I turned on every light in the room and paced back and forth, but the voice didn't stop. "I'm inside you," it said. The words were so alien and threatening that I felt true fear for the first time in my life. It wasn't just paranoia anymore. Something had invaded me. Day by day, things got worse. I started noticing gaps in my memory. Sometimes I'd find myself standing in front of the mirror, staring at my reflection, with no recollection of how I got there. My hands moved on their own, making strange gestures I couldn't understand. One night, I woke to the sound of scraping. The room was dark, and my body felt wrong. I turned on my phone's flashlight and froze. My hands were gripping a knife, slowly carving symbols into the wooden surface of my desk. "What are you doing?" I screamed, dropping the knife. The voice inside me laughed. "This isn't you, this is us." The symbols on the desk looked ancient, something out of a grimoire or a ritual. My hands bore fresh cuts, stinging as if to remind me of the reality I was now living in. I tried to brush it off as stress, as some kind of strange dream. But as the days passed, I realized this was no dream. By now, I felt like a prisoner in my own body. The sensation of something moving under my skin became more frequent. Sometimes it was subtle, like a deep itch, but other times it felt like something crawling through my veins. One night, I woke to the sound of my own scream. It was my voice, but I didn't remember screaming. I stumbled to the bathroom and stared at myself in the mirror. What I saw made my blood run cold. My eyes were entirely black, like bottomless pits. I blinked, and they returned to normal, but the image was seared into my mind. "You're just a vessel," the voice whispered. My hand moved on its own, reaching toward my face. I couldn't stop it. The thing inside me was laughing, reveling in my terror. I couldn't take it anymore. I began researching everything I could about spirits, possessions, and ancient rituals. Some sources suggested that such entities fed on fear, and the only way to weaken them was to fight back. I tried confronting it. I screamed at it, demanded it leave. "You think you're stronger than me?" The voice mocked. "You're just a shell." But sometimes I felt glimmers of hope. When the voice weakened, I managed to regain control, if only for a moment. One night, I found a ritual online. It required candles, symbols drawn in chalk, and incantations spoken aloud. As I prepared, the voice inside me grew louder, more frantic. "You're making a mistake," it growled. "You have no idea what you're doing." But I didn't stop. I lit the candles, drew the symbols, and began chanting the words. The room grew icy cold, and the lights flickered violently. "Stop!" the voice screamed. My body convulsed as though something was trying to break free. When I opened my eyes, the room was dark. The candles had gone out, and the symbols on the floor were smudged. For a moment, I felt relief. The entity was gone, or so I thought. Then I heard it. "Did you really think it would be that easy?" the voice whispered. My body moved against my will. I stood up, though I didn't want to. My reflection in the mirror smirked at me with a grin that wasn't mine. "This is my body now," the voice said. I realized I had lost. It had won, but I wasn't about to let it live through me. If I couldn't be free, neither could it. Gathering every ounce of willpower I had left, I grabbed the knife from my desk. "No," the voice screamed. With one final surge of strength, I drove the blade into my chest. The world went dark. It was just for fun. A silly, meaningless game that I regret every single day. It all started on a typical Friday evening. My friends, Lily, Mark, and I gathered at my house. My parents were away for the weekend, so we decided to spend the night sharing scary stories and watching horror movies. After a few hours, Lily pulled out a Ouija board. "I found it in my grandma's attic," she said with a mischievous grin. "Are you serious?" Mark asked, rolling his eyes dramatically. "It's just a toy." "No, Mark, it's not a toy," Lily said, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "It's a portal to the spirit world." We laughed, but I felt a small pang of unease. I had always thought things like that were a bit strange. "Come on, let's try it," Lily urged, setting up candles around the board. Mark rolled his eyes again but joined in. I hesitated, but I didn't want to look like a coward. We sat on the floor in a circle around the board. "Okay," Lily said. "Who wants to ask the first question?" After a brief pause, Mark smirked and said, "If there's anyone here, give us a sign." At first, nothing happened. We sat in silence, surrounded by the flickering candlelight. I felt the quiet grow heavier, as if the room were filling with something unseen. "Well," Mark said, "is this how it's supposed to work?" And then the planchette started to move. "Did you see that?" Lily whispered. "All right, who's messing with it?" Mark asked, his grin fading. "It's not me," Lily said, her eyes wide. I took my hands off the planchette, my heart racing with fear. But it kept moving. Even with no hands on it, it slid to the letter W, then to A and I. "W-A-I?" Lily whispered, reading aloud. "What does that mean?" Mark mumbled. Suddenly all the candles went out at once. The room plunged into darkness, and I heard someone exhale right next to us. We scrambled to turn on the lights, but they wouldn't work. Lily pulled out her phone, and its dim glow lit up her pale, terrified face. "We need to end the session," she whispered. "We have to say goodbye." "Yeah. Okay, goodbye," Mark said, his nervous laugh betraying his fear. Together we all said, "Goodbye." But the planchette started moving again, this time faster. It slid from letter to letter, spelling out DONTLEAVE. My stomach dropped. The room grew icy cold, and I felt something invisible brush past me. "This is just a joke, right?" Mark asked, his voice trembling. In response, a knock sounded. First from the corner of the room, then another from the opposite corner, and finally one right behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. "They're here," Lily whispered, clutching my arm tightly. From that moment, strange things began happening in the house. After my friends left, I felt as though I was being watched. In the darkness, I heard footsteps that stopped whenever I turned on the lights. The next night, I woke up to whispering. It was so close, as if someone was standing right by my bed. "You called us," the voice whispered. I switched on my bedside lamp, but no one was there. However, in the corner of the room, I saw a shadow. It moved on its own, even though there was no light source to cast it. I tried to convince myself that it was all just a consequence of the game. But deep down, I knew something had entered my home. I called Lily, but she didn't answer. I tried Mark, and his voice sounded strained, like he hadn't slept in days. "They're here," he said. "They won't leave me alone." That night, I heard knocking. At first it was faint and barely noticeable. Then it grew louder, turning into a pounding that echoed from all sides. I tried to ignore it, hiding under my blanket. But when I opened my eyes, I saw them. They stood in the corners of my room. Their shapes were blurry, like thick smoke, and their eyes burned red. I tried to close my eyes, but it didn't help. Their whispers filled the room. "You called us," they said. "Now we're here." My hands trembled as I froze in place. One of the figures stepped closer, its shadow stretching across the floor. I felt the cold radiating from it. "This was a mistake," I whispered. "I didn't mean to." "It's too late," they answered in unison. One of the shadows extended a hand, long and bony, its fingers like gnarled branches. It reached for me, and I felt a suffocating chill spread through my chest. I tried to scream, but my voice came out as a muffled gasp, swallowed by the darkness. Each day, their presence grew stronger. They followed me everywhere, to school, to the store, even into my dreams. I couldn't escape the feeling that they were closing in. Mark disappeared a week after that night. Lily ended up in the hospital after trying to hurt herself, saying they were inside her head. I was left alone, and I knew they wouldn't leave until they took me too. I decided I had to try something. I found an old article online about severing ties with spirits. It said I needed to go back to the board and finish the session properly. I retrieved the board from the closet where I had hidden it after that night. I placed it on the floor, lit candles around it, and sat down. "This is a mistake," a voice whispered behind me. I didn't turn around. I knew they were there. "I want to end this. Leave me alone," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The planchette began to move. It slid to the letters, spelling out N-O. The candles flickered violently, and the shadows around me began to shift. I felt the air grow colder, like invisible hands were reaching for my soul. "Leave," I screamed. The room filled with deafening screams, and then everything went silent. I woke up the next morning, lying on the floor. The board was split in two. Everything seemed normal, but I knew they weren't gone. Every night, I hear their whispers, and I know that one day, they'll return. Fog rolled over the swamps, hiding the rotting tombstones. Against the backdrop of a crimson sunset, the dark silhouette of the Harris estate looked less like a home and more like a monument to an ancient tragedy. No one dared to go near it, especially at night. The old folks whispered that from the broken windows one could hear a woman's cry. "It's her, the weeping bride," they said, waiting for the groom who will never come. Emily Brooks had heard these legends since childhood. Now at 25, she had returned to her hometown of Winston, a small American town in the middle of nowhere. As a journalist, she wanted to write an article about local ghost stories. And of course, the most terrifying of them all was the tale of the weeping bride. Emily checked into a motel on the outskirts of town. Her first destination was the old cemetery near the Harris estate. The rain came suddenly, cold droplets tapping against her umbrella. She moved between the crooked headstones when she saw it. Standing at the farthest grave was a figure, a woman in an old wedding dress. A long veil covered her head, and her hands hung lifelessly at her sides. Emily froze. Her heart pounded violently. The woman slowly began to turn her head toward her. Emily swallowed hard. Thick fog coiled around her legs, and the cold crept under her clothes, seeping into her skin. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the figure in the wedding dress. The woman turned slowly, too slowly, as if resisting some unseen force. Then Emily saw her face. The skin was deathly pale, the lips dry and cracked, but the eyes were completely empty. Only darkness reflected in them. Water dripped from beneath the sheer veil, as if it had soaked up the dampness of the other world. Emily took a step back, but her heel sank into the wet ground. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears. The woman raised her hand and stretched it toward Emily. "Can you see me?" The voice was weak, as if traveling through deep water. Emily wanted to scream, but all she could do was gasp for air. The figure stepped forward. The earth beneath her feet rippled, as though she were standing on quicksand. A faint whisper echoed around them, countless voices speaking all at once, yet the words were incomprehensible. Emily couldn't take it anymore. She turned and ran, stumbling over graves and muddy puddles. Behind her, a long, mournful wail carried through the night. She burst into her motel room, slammed the door shut, and leaned against it, gasping for breath. The room was dark, lit only by the dim glow of a streetlight filtering through the curtains. It was just my imagination, she tried to convince herself. But she had seen her. With trembling hands, Emily opened her laptop. She had to write everything down. Tonight, I went to the cemetery near the old Harris estate. The legend of the weeping bride is not just a story. I saw her. I heard her voice. But who is she, and what does she want? She finished typing and closed her laptop. Then outside the window, something rustled. Emily froze. A thin white figure slipped past the glass. She was here. The next morning, Emily headed to the local library. She needed to dig up every possible record about the weeping bride. According to legend, years ago, a young woman named Lillian Harris lived in the estate. On her wedding day, her fiancé, Henry Caldwell, vanished without a trace. Weeks later, his body was pulled from the river, but the cause of death remained a mystery. Lillian never recovered from the loss. On the day she was supposed to wear her wedding dress, she never took it off. In despair, she walked into the swamps and disappeared. Later, townsfolk found her veil tangled in the branches of a dead tree. Her body was never recovered. Since then, her ghost had been seen near the estate, eternally searching for her lost groom. "You've seen her too, haven't you?" a voice said behind her. Emily spun around. An elderly woman with thin, wispy gray hair stood before her. "What? The weeping bride? You saw her, didn't you?" Emily swallowed hard. "Yes, but who are you?" The woman sighed heavily and sat down at a nearby table. "My name is Margaret Harris. I am the last of the Harris bloodline, and I know how her curse began." Emily's breath caught in her throat. "Tell me everything." Margaret's gaze darkened. "But you must be ready, because if she has seen you, she will never let you go." Margaret Harris sat across from Emily in the musty library. Her hands trembled as she turned the yellowed pages of an old album. "Lillian was the last hope of the Harris family," she began. "Our bloodline was dying out, generation after generation. Her father, Edgar Harris, was obsessed with continuing the lineage. He chose a groom for her, Henry Caldwell." Emily listened carefully, scribbling notes. "But Henry, he never loved Lillian." Margaret let out a bitter laugh. "It was just a deal. Her father promised him land, influence, and wealth. But the night before the wedding, he vanished." "Was he murdered?" Emily asked. Margaret slowly nodded. "His body was found in the river weeks later, but the strange thing was, he hadn't drowned. His lungs were dry." Emily frowned. "What? How is that possible?" Margaret pressed her lips into a thin line. "They say Lillian knew more than she let on. That night, she disappeared from the house. And in the morning, they found her near the swamp, covered in mud, her dress torn." She exhaled sharply. "The servants swore they heard her speaking to someone who wasn't there." "You mean?" She called upon something to take revenge. A chill ran down Emily's spine. "What exactly?" Margaret looked her straight in the eye. "The weeping bride." Emily couldn't shake Margaret's words from her mind. She had to return to the Harris estate. The night was bright with moonlight. The house stood shrouded in darkness, its empty windows like hollow eyes. Emily stepped inside. The wooden floor creaked under her weight. The air reeked of dampness and decay. On the second floor, she found an old mirror. Its frame was covered in cobwebs, the glass clouded and dull. As she moved closer, something appeared on the surface. A face. Lillian. Her lips moved soundlessly. Emily staggered back, but something grabbed her wrist. She turned. No one was there. But the mirror cracked. The cracked mirror trembled as if it were alive. Thin fractures spread across its surface like a web spun by an unseen hand. Emily froze, staring at the reflection. Lillian's face was right in front of her, pale as wax with dark hollows where her eyes should have been, eyes filled with endless sorrow. Her lips trembled, but Emily couldn't hear a single sound. Then, Lillian opened her mouth. A whisper slithered into Emily's mind, wrapping around her thoughts like a cold, sticky fog. "He lied. He lied to me. He did not love me." The words echoed in the empty room, though Lillian's lips did not move. Emily took a step back and felt something wet and sticky beneath her feet. The floor had turned into a rotting black sludge. She screamed, yanking her arm free from the unseen grip. The moment she did, the mirror shattered into thousands of shards, and an eerie silence swallowed the room. Her heart pounded against her ribs. She had to get out. Now. But when Emily turned toward the exit, she saw that the doorway was no longer empty. A bride stood there. Lillian. Her dress was torn and soaked in a dark, viscous liquid. Her veil dripped with something that smelled of rot. Slowly, Lillian raised a hand and dragged her fingers across her throat. "Will you betray him too?" Her voice was dry, brittle, like dead leaves rustling in the wind. Emily took a step back. No, I just want to know the truth." Lillian tilted her head to the side. And then, she vanished. The doorway was open again. Emily didn't hesitate. She bolted down the stairs, refusing to look back. As she burst out of the estate into the cold night air, she thought she had escaped. But it was a lie. The weeping bride knew her name now, and she wasn't going to let her go. Emily sat in her motel room, hugging herself. Why had the weeping bride chosen her? That night, she dreamed. She stood in an old ballroom, dimly lit by flickering chandeliers. Shadows swayed, their movements slow and deliberate. They were dancing. Men in tuxedos, women in flowing gowns. Their faces were blurred, as if erased from a photograph. Lillian stood in the center. Her wedding dress was pure white, like on the day of her wedding. She reached out her hand. "Dance with me." Emily's feet moved on their own. She didn't want to, but her body refused to obey. The music grew louder. Lillian's hands were as cold as marble. Her black eyes gleamed. "Your groom, did he betray you too?" "What?" Lillian squeezed her fingers. "They all lie." The music stopped. Emily woke up screaming. Her hands were ice cold. But that wasn't the worst part. On her finger was a wedding ring. Emily had to find the truth. At the library, she uncovered a letter. Lillian's letter. "Henry, if you do not come, I will curse this day. Let your lies echo in the darkness. Let all who stand between me and my vows feel my sorrow." Emily's blood ran cold. This was not just a ghost. This was a curse. The archive door creaked open. Emily turned. But she already knew who was standing there. Lillian smiled. "Now you are mine." No one in Winston ever heard from Emily Brooks again. But if you walk past the Harris estate at night, you might hear two voices singing the wedding march. Once a bride, always a bride. I had always found old things unsettling. Antique items seemed to carry some kind of energy, like they were tied to a past better left alone. My mom, however, adored them. Every weekend, she would scour flea markets and antique shops, returning home with something new. Dusty books, candle holders, porcelain figurines. "They have a soul," she'd say, carefully dusting off her latest find. I never believed her words until she brought home the doll. It happened on a Saturday. I was sitting in the kitchen when Mom came home, her arms full of treasures. Among them was a large bag, from which she pulled it. "Look at this amazing find," she exclaimed, holding up the doll. The doll was strange. Tall, made of porcelain, with faded blue eyes that seemed unnervingly large. Her black hair was curled into glossy ringlets, and her once white dress was now a dirty, tattered gray. "Mom, why do you even need this?" I asked, my irritation obvious. "She's beautiful, a rare antique," Mom said, clearly oblivious to how eerie the doll looked. She placed the doll on a shelf in the living room, directly across from the couch. Now, every time I sat there, I could feel its glassy gaze following me. Sometimes I even thought its head was slightly turned toward me, though I knew that was impossible. I tried to ignore it, brushing off my unease as overactive imagination. But each night, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The next night, she came back. This time, I found myself in a desolate street. The asphalt glistened as though it had recently rained, but there were no clouds or stars above. Silence enveloped me, oppressive and deafening. The only sound I could hear was my own breathing. I turned around and saw her again. She stood beneath a flickering streetlight, her figure eerily still. The weak light cast her shadow across the pavement, and I noticed her appearance had worsened. Her face was now even more grotesque, the cracks in her skin deeper, oozing a black, viscous liquid. She pointed at me again, her movements unnervingly deliberate. Her lips moved, and this time her whisper was louder, cutting through the silence. "You cannot escape." I tried to run, but she appeared directly in front of me, as if she had bypassed time and space. Her bony hands reached for me, unnaturally long and claw-like. Once again, I screamed and woke up. This time, I couldn't catch my breath. Sweat poured down my face and my heart pounded so violently it echoed in my ears. I couldn't sleep after that. I sat on my bed, hugging my knees, waiting for the sun to rise. After the second dream, I started noticing strange things. When I walked home one evening, I felt eyes on me. Every time I turned around, the street was empty, but the shadows seemed longer, stretching unnaturally under the streetlights. One night, I heard faint scratching sounds coming from the hallway. The noise was so similar to the sound of her steps in my dream that I couldn't bring myself to leave my room. The most terrifying thing happened a few days later. I was in the bathroom washing my face. When I looked up at the mirror, I saw her. She was standing right behind me. Her grotesque, broken face was inches from my shoulder. Her empty, black eyes bored into mine. I spun around, but the bathroom was empty. That's when I realized she wasn't just part of my dreams anymore. That night, I woke to the sound of movement in the corner of my room. It was faint, like nails dragging across the floor. I turned on my nightlight and saw her. She was standing in the corner, her head tilted unnaturally to one side. Her cracked lips moved, and I heard her familiar whisper, "I see you." I screamed and reached for the light switch, but the lamp wouldn't turn on. She took a step toward me, her jerky movements resembling a broken puppet. Her limbs seemed to stretch, her figure looming larger. Panicking, I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam of light hit her face, and in an instant, she vanished, dissolving into the air like smoke. But I knew this wasn't over. After that night, her presence became a constant in my life. I saw her reflection in windows as I walked down the street. I heard her whispers behind closed doors. Every time I closed my eyes to sleep, she would return. Her face became more monstrous, her whispers louder, drowning out my own thoughts. "You belong to me," she repeated over and over. One evening, I came home and found my bedroom door slightly ajar. On the wall opposite my bed, something was scratched into the paint. When I moved closer, I saw the words, "I'm here." That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in bed, clutching a knife, though I knew it wouldn't protect me. I found an article online about entities that cross over from dreams into reality. It said such beings feed on fear, and the only way to banish them is to starve them of their power. I decided to face her. That night, I lit candles and sat in the center of my room, waiting for her to come. When I heard her steps, I wanted to run, but I stayed. She appeared in the corner, her body contorted and oozing black liquid from her cracks. Her eyes locked on mine as she moved closer. "You don't scare me," I said, though my voice trembled. She paused. Her face began to distort, her form unraveling. "You cannot defeat me," she hissed, but her voice was weaker. I closed my eyes and repeated, "You're not real. You can't hurt me." Her figure started to dissolve, fading into smoke. When I opened my eyes, the room was gone. I was standing in a void, and in the distance I saw her, a faint, fading shadow disappearing into nothingness. She hasn't returned, but sometimes in the silence of the night, I hear a faint whisper, a reminder that fear never truly leaves. The town of Red Creek had always been a quiet place. Population fewer than 5,000. Small houses, evergreen forests all around, and a sense of peace. But once a month, on the night of the full moon, everything changed. No one went outside. Doors were locked from the inside, and everyone waited. Waited for it to finish feeding. Jack Ford, a 30-year-old mechanic, never believed in monster stories. But that night, he heard the screams, real ones. Not myths, not childhood horror tales. Human screams full of terror. He looked out the window and saw it, a silhouette among the trees, tall, too tall. The street lamp cast its weak light onto a massive figure with glowing yellow eyes. And then it looked right at him, and Jack realized that the next victim was him. Jack couldn't move. The creature stood at the edge of the forest, half hidden in the shadows. Massive, unreal. It breathed heavily, rasping. The air itself seemed to vibrate, as if the night had thickened, become heavier. Jack blinked. The figure was gone. No, it was moving, fast. First, to the left, then a sharp dart to the right. It wasn't walking. It was gliding through the darkness like a predator picking its angle of attack. Something icy gripped his chest, and then silence. No footsteps, no rustling leaves, but Jack felt it. It was there, somewhere close, watching. He shut the curtains, pressed his back against the wall, and held his breath. The night passed, but the fear remained. At dawn, Jack finally gathered his courage and stepped onto his porch, and froze. On the ground, right beneath his window, were tracks. But they were wrong. Not human, not animal, too long, too deep. 5 clawed marks dug into the dirt as if something had been raking the ground with its hands. And something even worse. The tracks didn't lead into the forest. They started right at his window, as if something had stood there, watching. The tracks under his window didn't disappear. Jack couldn't unsee them, no matter how much he wanted to. He wanted to tell himself it was a prank, that his imagination was playing tricks on him. But no, they were real, deep, fresh, and the only thing he knew for certain, he didn't want to know what had made them. The next day, when Jack arrived at his auto shop, the town was already talking about a disappearance. Dan Harper, the local forester, had gone missing during the night. Neighbors heard him screaming, and then silence. When the police arrived at his house, they found only his front door left wide open and bloody footprints leading into the woods. Jack felt a chill crawl up his spine. The screams, he had heard them that night too. But something even worse made his stomach tighten. When he asked where exactly Dan had disappeared, he got his answer. On the outskirts, near the forest, by the old farm, near his house. That evening, Jack came home earlier than usual. He locked the doors, closed the windows, and waited. But instead of the usual night silence, he heard something else. From the forest, far away, but too close, came a whisper, low, inhuman. Not a voice, a whisper, as if something was calling his name. Jack. He froze. Come. No, No, he wouldn't go. But his feet were already moving toward the door. Jack stopped at the last second. His hand was already touching the doorknob. But he didn't open the door. He didn't let himself go outside. And yet, something out there in the woods knew his name. The next morning, Jack went to the local library. Red Creek was a small town, but it had a long past, and in that past, he hoped to find answers. Miss Phillips, the elderly librarian, raised her eyebrows when he asked about strange events related to the full moon. "I thought no one asked about that anymore," she murmured. Half an hour later, Jack was sitting in front of a stack of old newspapers and faded documents. And there, he found what he was looking for. Almost every 10 years, Red Creek had an unsolved disappearance, always on the night of the full moon. 1953, Farmer Henry Wells vanished. A week later, his body was found torn to pieces in the woods. 1964, Sarah Dowling went missing. Her body was never found. 1975, Forester Harold Reeves. Only his clothes were found, hanging from the trees. Again and again. Then he found another article. It had been 10 years since the last case, and a new victim was due. In the faded records, he stumbled upon a name he had never heard before. The Black Stag. That's what they called something that emerged from the forest once every 10 years, when the full moon coincided with the first snowfall. Locals believed it was a creature, a ghost, or the spirit of an ancient curse. A massive shadow with burning eyes. It didn't kill to eat, it hunted for sport. And those who saw it, there was nowhere left for them to run. Jack went cold. He had seen it that night. And now he knew who the next victim was. Himself. Jack knew his time was running out. He didn't understand how it worked. Why did the monster choose only those who had seen it? But he knew one thing. He had seen it, and that meant he was next. That night, Jack didn't sleep. He locked the door, closed the windows. But the fear was inside him, as if he already knew that resisting was pointless, as if it had already come for him. At 2:46 a.m., the first sound came. Footsteps outside, but not normal footsteps. Heavy, measured, like something enormous was moving slowly but deliberately. Step, pause, inhale. Then, a knock on the window. Jack didn't move. A massive shadow blocked the glow of the street lamp, and then it looked in through the window, burning yellow eyes, a long tattered shadow. It was watching him. And then a voice echoed inside his mind. "Come out." The voice wasn't loud, but it burrowed straight into his thoughts. "Come out, Jack." His hand reached for the door handle on its own. No, it was playing with him. It was waiting. It knew. But his legs no longer listened to him. He opened the door. Jack opened the door. The freezing night air hit his face. It stood on the threshold. Tall. Too tall. Not human. Not an animal. Something else. Darkness given form. The creature didn't move. It just stared at him. Its glowing eyes burned into his mind. And deep inside, in the pit of his soul, Jack felt that it was waiting. Waiting for his decision. Run or accept. He could run, but where? How do you escape something that comes for you even in your dreams? The wind howled. Somewhere far away, a wolf howled in response. Jack took a step forward. The monster didn't flinch. His voice broke. The creature tilted its head. "You saw." Jack understood. It didn't hunt random people. It gave a choice. It waited. And now, the choice was his. Run and hide, or accept what was already inevitable. He took another step. The forest called to him. In the darkness, shadows moved. Others. Just like it. Yellow eyes glowed in the night. And he realized this wasn't the end, it was the beginning. At sunrise, the town of Red Creek found Jack's house. The door was wide open. There were no signs of struggle, but Jack was gone, vanished, like all the others before him, like everyone who had seen the black stag. But deep in the forest, hidden in the shadows, something new was hunting, and it still remembered its name. Once, it had been Jack Ford. Now, it was one of them. 10 years passed. The town forgot. People stopped being afraid. The full moon no longer made them uneasy, but one night a scream echoed through the darkness. And in someone's window, 2 yellow eyes reflected back. Edward Miller moved into his new apartment at the end of October. It was a small studio on the 3rd floor of an old brick building. Peeling paint, creaky floors, barely functioning heating, not the best place to live. But rent was cheap, and his job as a local journalist barely covered his expenses. The building had once been a hotel, but was later converted into apartments. Narrow hallways, long stairwells, dim lighting, it all felt gloomy and somewhat oppressive. But at least it was quiet. The residents were mostly elderly people and loners. Edward barely saw anyone. An old lady on the 1st floor, a silent young man living 2 floors up, and a middle-aged man who always smoked on the staircase at the same time every evening. Then, one night, a new tenant moved into the apartment next door. Edward first heard him late at night. Slow, deliberate footsteps in the hallway, the sound of a door closing, then silence. The next day, he saw him for the first time. Mr. Holden, tall, gaunt, unnaturally pale as if he had never seen the sun. His hair was sparse and his eyes black as coal. They absorbed light rather than reflected it, sending a deep, unsettling feeling through Edward's stomach. They crossed paths in the hallway. "You just moved in?" Edward asked, trying to make conversation. "Yes. Hope I won't be a bother." Holden replied with a tight, too stiff smile. That smile reminded Edward of a mask, something artificial. Hiding something. Wrong. "No, it's fine," Edward mumbled, hurrying back into his apartment. But something about this man wouldn't leave his mind, and soon he would understand why. Edward woke up in the middle of the night, 3:14 a.m. The apartment was dark, with only faint streetlights casting shadows through the blinds. He was about to roll over and go back to sleep when he heard it. A rustling sound, like furniture being dragged. Heavy, scraping noises coming from behind the wall, Holden's apartment. Edward frowned. Maybe he's just unpacking? But the sound was too slow, too deliberate, like someone was dragging something heavy across the floor. Then, a muffled voice. Not words, just a low, rasping whisper. Edward tensed. It was 3 a.m. Who could Holden possibly be talking to? The whispering continued. It was faint at first, but gradually grew louder. Edward felt an unnerving chill. He moved closer to the wall, pressing his ear against it. The whispering stopped. A tense silence filled the room. Then, a dull knock. Right against the wall. As if someone realized they were being listened to, and knocked back. Edward stumbled away from the wall. His heart pounded. He sat in the dark, staring at the faint light from the blinds, trying to convince himself that nothing strange had happened. But he had no idea what awaited him. The next day, Edward tried to convince himself that it was nothing. Maybe he just knocked by accident. Maybe it was a coincidence. But deep inside, a feeling of unease continued to grow. All day, he felt like someone was watching him. At the store, in a cafe, even just walking down the street. An odd sensation crept over him, as if unseen eyes were following his every move. But whenever he turned around, there was no one. The missing girl. Late that evening, Edward was walking down the stairwell when he heard someone crying. He stopped. The sound came from below. Step by step, he walked down to the second floor. A young woman stood in front of apartment 24. She looked to be in her early 20s. Red hair, a thin face, trembling hands gripping her phone. She noticed Edward and immediately looked away. Are you okay? He asked cautiously. She said nothing, only tightened her grip on her phone. Are you waiting for someone? She swallowed hard and whispered, My friend, she lives here, but she's not answering. Edward looked at the door, apartment 24, directly below Holden's apartment. Maybe she's not home? The girl shook her head. No, she texted me yesterday, said she had something important to tell me. Edward's stomach twisted. What was it? The girl hesitated. She said she noticed something strange about her neighbor upstairs. Edward's breath hitched. Holden? She nodded. At that moment, the hallway light flickered. For a few seconds, everything plunged into darkness. Edward froze, listening. Somewhere above, a door creaked. When the light came back on, the girl was gone. Just gone. Like she had never been there. A week passed. Edward tried to act normal, but the unease never left him. Where had that girl gone? Why had her friend disappeared? But the strangest thing was, no one asked questions. The old lady on the first floor just shrugged when he asked about apartment 24. That place has been empty for a long time. Empty? But the girl said. A chill ran through Edward's spine. The late-night sounds. The noises from Holden's apartment continued. Footsteps, slow, steady movements. One night, he heard something new, a scratching sound, like claws dragging across wood. Edward couldn't take it anymore. He stepped into the hallway. The dim light flickered. Holden's door looked normal. But at the end of the hallway, something was wrong. A door that shouldn't exist. Edward knew the building. He knew there wasn't a door at the end of the hall. But now there was. An old wooden door. Dark, no handle. What is this? The door was slightly open, and from the darkness inside, a whisper. Edward stood frozen in the hallway. The impossible door gaped open at the end of the corridor. A thin sliver of darkness spilled from within, deeper than any shadow should be. And from inside, a whisper. It wasn't coming from a person. It was everywhere at once, low, crawling into his mind like cold fingers pressing against his skull. You hear me, don't you? Edward's breath hitched. He didn't want to move closer, but his legs did. One step, another. His heartbeat pounded in his ears as he reached out and nudged the door open. Creak. Inside was nothing. An empty black void. No walls, no floor, just the faint sensation of movement, like something inside was breathing. Then Edward saw the hand. It emerged from the darkness. Long, unnatural fingers, pale as death with blackened nails. It moved too fluidly, searching, feeling the air, looking for him. Edward's body snapped back to life. The hand lunged forward. He slammed the door shut. The hallway was normal again. But he knew now this was no hallucination. That door existed, and something inside was watching. Edward couldn't ignore it anymore. He needed to know the truth. A midnight stakeout. At 2 a.m. he sat by his door, waiting, listening, waiting. Then he heard him. Holden was moving inside his apartment. Slow steps, 1, 2, 3. A pause, then dragging sounds, like he was pulling something heavy. Edward's entire body screamed at him, leave it alone. But it was too late. He grabbed his phone and started recording. Then quietly he turned his doorknob and stepped into the hallway. It was empty. But Holden's door, it was slightly open. Light spilled into the hall, dim and yellow, and inside, the room of death. 2 tables, one covered in tools, knives, scalpels, long metal needles. The other, something wrapped in black plastic. Edward's stomach twisted. His eyes darted to the walls, photos, faces, people who had disappeared, and among them, the red-haired girl. Edward's breath turned ragged. That's when he heard a single step behind him. A low voice, almost amused. "You weren't supposed to see this." Edward turned. Holden stood in the doorway. His black eyes were locked onto him. His lips curved into a smile. Edward's body locked up. Mr. Holden stood between him and the only exit. His pale skin looked even more unnatural under the flickering light. But the worst part was his expression. There was no anger, no fear, only curiosity. Like Edward was something interesting to him. A new specimen, a new victim. "You shouldn't have come in here," Holden murmured. His voice was calm, collected, but there was something predatory in it. Like he already knew there was no way out. Edward took a step back. Now he saw everything. "You killed them," Edward whispered. "I preserved them," Holden corrected, still smiling. He gestured at the photographs. "Each of them is part of something bigger." Holden stepped forward. Edward stepped back. "You're afraid," Holden tilted his head. "But don't be. It's quick." Edward didn't wait. He bolted for the door. Holden lunged. The hallway stretched endlessly. The stairs groaned beneath his feet as he flew down them. But Holden was right behind him. Fast, silent, inhuman. Edward hit the first floor and lunged for the exit, but the front door was locked. Outside was only darkness. "Did you think I didn't know you were watching?" Holden's voice came from behind. Edward whirled around. Holden stood just a few feet away. His hands were empty, but it didn't matter. He didn't need a weapon. He was the weapon. "You're already part of this, Edward," Holden said, smiling. "There's no way out now. One last chance." But there was a way out. Edward turned and sprinted back upstairs. He reached his apartment, grabbed his keys, his hands shaking as he jammed them into the lock. The door swung open. He dove inside and slammed it shut. Silence. A knock. Footsteps outside his door. Then, nothing. Edward stood, back pressed to the door, his lungs burning. But Holden didn't try to enter. He just left. Like he knew something. Like he knew that one day Edward would step outside again. Somewhere in the dark building. 3 days passed. Edward didn't leave his apartment. He called the police, but they found nothing. No Holden, no photographs, no bodies, nothing. As if none of it had ever existed. But at night, he still heard whispers through the wall. "You know, this isn't over."